the British Royal Guard, who escorted the Gold State coach to Westminster Abbey, a journey of honor and duty. His left boot had a crack in the sole. He found it at 4 in the morning, 3 hours before the briefing, 2 hours before the sun had any business rising over London. Corporal James Aldridge stood in the narrow light of the barracks corridor and pressed his thumb along the split leather and felt the cold, specific panic of a man whose entire life has been building toward a single day and who has just discovered that the day has a flaw in it. He did not shout. He did not wake anyone. He sat down on the wooden bench outside the kit room and held the boot in both hands and breathed the way his color sergeant had taught him to breathe when everything inside him wanted to do something foolish. In through the nose, out slowly. Again. James Aldridge was 31 years old. He had been a soldier in the Household Cavalry for 9 years, 6 months, and 4 days. He kept count, not because he was sentimental, but because counting was a thing you could hold on to when everything else felt like it was sliding. He had done 2 overseas tours, 1 ceremonial exchange posting in Ottawa, and more mounted rehearsals on the cobblestones of Hyde Park Barracks than he could accurately remember. He had trained in the rain, in the dark, in temperatures that made the horses bad-tempered and the men worse. He had held still on horseback, while crowds pressed close enough to touch the stirrups. He had done all of it without complaint, without drama, without once allowing his face to say what his face sometimes wanted to say. And now there was a crack in his boot. He turned it over and looked at the sole in the corridor light. The crack ran across the heel, following the line where the leather had bent one too many times over wet cobblestones. Not a dramatic split. Under ordinary circumstances, it might have held for another week, but these were not ordinary circumstances. These were the specific circumstances of 3 kilometers of road in cold October air, with his full body weight pressing down across several hours, and he knew with complete certainty that by the time they reached the Abbey, this crack would have become something considerably worse. He set the boot on the bench and thought about options. He was methodical by nature. 9 years of service had refined that quality into something close to an art form. The ability to assess a problem without panic, rank the solutions by practicality, and move on the best one without spending time wishing the problem had arrived on a different morning. Supply rooms existed for exactly this purpose. He knocked on the kit room door at 4:18. Owen Fletcher opened it in under a minute. Fletcher was a corporal, short and efficient, never entirely awake before 6 but trained by long practice to function before that hour when the job required it. He looked at James. He looked at the boot James was carrying. He turned without a word and went to the supply room and came back in 4 minutes with a pair that were half a size too large and handed them over without being asked and without expressing any opinion about the hour or the situation or the inconvenience of any of it. James stuffed the toes with folded cloth from the rag bin, laced the replacements tighter than comfortable, walked the corridor twice to test them, and decided they would hold. "You look terrible," Fletcher said. "I look exactly the same as always," James said. "That is what I mean," Fletcher said, and went back to bed. James had not slept. He had lain on his bunk from 11 the previous night until somewhere around 2 in the morning, at which point he accepted that sleep was a destination not available to him tonight, and stopped trying for it, and simply lay still with his hands folded on his chest, and managed the waiting the same way he managed most difficult things, which was by going very quiet and letting the hours move over him. He had wanted this assignment for 2 years. He had not told anyone that. In the Household Cavalry, you did not campaign for postings, you did not lobby your sergeant major, you did not make it known what you wanted from the system. You performed at the level required, consistently, without visible ambition, and you waited to see what the Army decided to do with you. That was the arrangement from the first week of training, and James had understood it and had never broken it. But wanting does not require permission. It happens in the background, behind the straight back and the level eyes, behind everything the uniform requires of a person who has chosen to wear it. When the posting came through, his name on the list, mounted escort, Gold State coach, he had read it twice, folded the paper, and put it in his trouser pocket. He carried it there for the rest of the day without taking it out again. He did not need to. He knew what it said. He had read it twice, because the first time had not felt entirely real, and the second time confirmed it. His mother, Pauline, had called that evening. She always called on Tuesdays, which that day happened to be. She asked how he was. He said fine. She asked if anything was happening at work. He paused for exactly 1 second too long, and she caught it the way she had caught things across 31 years of phone calls, across every pause that meant more than the silence around it. "James," she said. "It is the Gold State Coach Escort," he said. "Westminster Abbey." There was a silence on the line. Not an empty silence, a full one, the kind that carries more than words can move without difficulty. "Your dad," she said. "I know," he said. "He will want to know." "I know, Mum." He had not called his father. He had thought about it for 4 days, then stopped thinking about it, which is its own kind of decision, and one he recognized as a decision even while making it. His father, Edward Aldridge, was 63 years old and lived in a semi-detached house in Coventry with Pauline and a television that was always on, and an armchair that had shaped itself to him over many years of regular occupancy. Edward had been a factory supervisor for 22 years, until the factory closed. He had done other things after, smaller things, quieter things, and had never quite recovered the specific confidence a man builds when he is genuinely good at something and then has it taken away. Edward had never served in the military. When James announced at 18 that he was enlisting, Edward looked at him across the kitchen table with an expression James had spent years trying to decode. Not anger, not disappointment exactly. Something older and harder to name. Something that looked, from where James stood at 18, almost like a man recognizing a thing he had once refused and watching it walk out the door in his son's body instead. "Ceremonial," Edward had said, after a long pause. "All that marching about." "Yes," James had said. Edward said nothing more. He pushed his chair back, went to stand at the kitchen window, and looked out at the yard. 10 seconds. Then he said nothing further, and that had been the conversation. That had been, in many ways, the only real conversation they ever had on the subject. James had enlisted anyway. He had trained. He had been good at it, genuinely, consistently, more than good, though he would never have described it that way. His instructors used words that trainees around him noticed. His record used the kind of official language that, translated into plain speech, meant this man holds when holding is the hardest option available. He was that man. He had been that man for 9 years, quietly and without announcement, and this morning he was going to prove it on the most public road in England. The briefing was at 5:30 in the ceremonial room, which smelled of polish and old wood, and 60 men arriving before dawn. Colonel George Parrish stood at the front without notes. He covered the route, the formation, the crowd figures, the weather forecast, the conservation team's concerns about the gold leaf panels. He ended with the words that stilled the room. "You are not decoration, you are the image. You are what this country looks like when it wants to show the world what it is." James sat in the 3rd row and felt those words land somewhere in his chest. He pressed his feet flat against the floor inside the 2 large boots, felt the cloth in the toes, and thought, yes, that is exactly what this is. He dressed in the locker room with care, the scarlet tunic, every strap and buckle and lace attended to, the brass buttons he had polished for 3 nights catching the overhead light and giving it back cleanly. The bearskin sat on the shelf above the locker, enormous and formal and faintly absurd when seen alone out of context, just a large black object on a shelf. In context it would look like authority. It would look like history standing upright on a public road and refusing to give ground. He looked at himself in the narrow mirror and saw what the country would see in a few hours. The tunic, the buttons, the bearskin, the straight back, the level eyes. He could not see what was behind those eyes. That, as always, was the point. Fletcher appeared in the doorway, already in uniform, already looking like a soldier, and not like a person who had been handling a boot problem in the corridor 3 hours earlier. "Boot still holding?" he said. "Boot is fine," James said. Fletcher nodded and moved on. There was nothing further to say. They walked out into the gray London morning together, boots on cobblestones, their breath small clouds in the October cold. The city was already a different version of itself. The flags along the barriers, the crowds 3 rows deep in places, the particular quality of a city that has set itself aside from its ordinary business and arranged itself around something old and important that is about to happen on its streets and wants every available vantage point when it does. James walked and said nothing, and felt, in the cold and the quiet before the day began in earnest, something he had no good name for, older and simpler and more inconvenient than pride, something that had been living in him since a kitchen table in Coventry where a conversation had ended at a window and never quite resumed. He was here. He had got here. Whatever had tried to prevent it, the cracked boot, the sleepless night, 13 years of a conversation stalled at a window, he was here, in the tunic, on the day. For now, that was everything there was. He stepped onto the cobblestones, and the sound of his own boots echoed back from the barracks wall, and he felt, for a single clear moment, the full length of the route ahead. Not just the physical kilometers, those he knew well enough to walk in his sleep. The other length, the one that had started at a kitchen table in Coventry and had taken 13 years to travel and had brought him to this gray London morning with cloth in his toes and his breath in the cold air. He put the distance behind him and walked on. The horse's name was Gideon. He was 16 hands high, black from mane to hoof, and he had been assigned to James for 3 of the 4 mounted rehearsals, which in the world of ceremonial cavalry was as close to a genuine working partnership as the program's schedule allowed. James knew Gideon's particular tells, the way the animal shifted his weight before a sudden sound reached him, the pressure he put on the left rein when something in the periphery unsettled him, the slight forward drop of the head that meant he had processed something alarming and decided, as a professional matter, that it did not require action. He knew the specific quality of stillness Gideon produced when everything around him was noise and the only thing being asked of him was to hold. It was not the stillness of an unaware animal. It was the stillness of one that was fully aware and had made a decision about it. They understood each other in the way that people and animals understand each other when they have spent enough hours in difficult conditions side by side without the option of walking away. James arrived at the mews at 6:50 and went directly to Gideon's stable. He put his hand flat against the horse's neck and felt the warmth there and waited. Gideon turned one large dark eye toward him with the expression of an animal that has made its calculation about trust and arrived at a satisfactory conclusion. James felt something in his chest loosen by a small degree. He could not have explained why this helped. It always helped. "All right," James said. To the horse, to himself, to the general and specific situation of this particular morning. The mews at that hour was controlled movement in a compressed space. 11 horses being groomed and tacked, 12 guards moving between them, grooms working with the focused economy of people who know precisely where every second is needed and do not waste any of them on anything else. Nobody spoke more than the task required. The horses bore it all with the patient expertise of animals, trained at considerable expense to be patient. James moved through it efficiently, checking Gideon's saddle, bridle, and breastplate with the attention of a man who knows that equipment failure, at the wrong moment on a day like this one, is the kind of failure that does not offer a second chance. Outside, London had been filling itself up since long before the sun arrived. He had glimpsed it on the walk from the barracks. Pavements already 3 rows deep in places, people who had arrived the previous afternoon and camped overnight with their flasks and folding chairs, and their children asleep against their sides. He had not let himself look for too long. Looking too long at a crowd before a ceremonial was a trap he had made once in his early career and had not repeated. It made the abstract concrete. 3 million people became something the body felt in the chest, rather than a number the mind could file away at a useful distance, and the chest needed to stay clear. He filed the number at a distance and did not look at it directly. At 7:30, Parrish came through the mews and walked the line without speaking. His eyes moved down the row with the even, experienced assessment of a man who sees not just readiness, but the less visible thing beneath it, the quality of composure that the day was going to require for several hours, and whether each man in the line had it present on him this particular morning. He stopped at the end and turned. "Steady," he said. One word. The room held it, the way a room holds something true when someone says it without decoration. James mounted Gideon at 7:45. The horse adjusted beneath him, the small recalibration of a familiar weight finding its arrangement in the saddle, and then went still. James settled upright and felt the particular physical state of being on horseback in full ceremonial dress, which was unlike any other state he knew. Weight distributed differently. Height changed everything. The position communicated something to the world before you communicated anything intentionally. You were visible from every angle, with nowhere to retreat, and the visibility was not a condition to manage but the requirement itself. They walked out through the Mews gate at 8 o'clock exactly. The city sound arrived the moment they cleared the gate, the crowd sound, the specific acoustic quality of a very large number of people who have been waiting for a long time and are now seeing something begin. Not a roar yet, an anticipation. A held breath finding its first partial release, the sustained low note of thousands of voices that have not yet reached full volume and are holding themselves there deliberately. Gideon's ears moved forward. James felt the slight tightening through the reins and held steady, and the horse steadied with him. The mall was lined in both directions as far as James could see. He kept his eyes at the fixed point in the middle distance and took in the rest, through the periphery he had spent years learning to use, without appearing to use it. The flags, the color of the crowd against the barriers, the children lifted onto shoulders, the phones raised above every head the full length of the road. He did not look at individual faces, he looked at the middle distance, and the reason behind the rule was not arbitrary. You catch one specific face, one real person with a real feeling, and the feeling enters you through your eyes, and you are feeling it too, and you are not permitted to feel it here, not in the line, not in the tunic. So you look at the middle distance, you see everything, and you fix on nothing. It is harder than it sounds. It becomes reliable only through repetition over a long period, and James had put in the repetition. He kept 47 paces per minute. Gideon's rhythm was beneath him like a second set of breathing, steady, familiar, the pace they had built together through rehearsal until the coordination lived in the body and no longer required the conscious mind. They moved through the first stretch of the mall, and James held everything in place and was, for those opening minutes, exactly what the occasion required. Then the Gold State coach came out. He had seen it before. He had ridden alongside it in rehearsal, had stood close enough to read the carved figures on the panels and to note where the restoration team's most recent work sat against the original gilding that had darkened with age into something richer than new gold. He had prepared for what it looked like. He had assumed the seeing of it in rehearsal and the seeing of it today would feel broadly similar. They did not feel similar. He was not prepared for what it sounded like in motion, at this scale. The weight of the thing coming up through the road surface and through Gideon's hooves and through the saddle and into James's own body before his ears had processed it. 4 tons of carriage and accumulated history and meaning in forward motion. The wheels on the cobblestones. The 11 horses pulling together, their collective effort becoming pace. The slight give of the bodywork under its own mass. And then the crowd. 3 million people going quieter when it appeared. Not silent. The quieting that happens when something genuinely old and genuinely significant moves in front of a large number of people who have been waiting to see it. A shift in the collective sound that you feel in your ribcage before you understand it with your mind. James rode alongside it and felt the shift go through him and thought, in the narrow private space behind his face, there it is. That is the thing itself. That is what all of it has been building toward. His face showed none of this. His face was doing its job with complete reliability. The crowd built in sections as the procession moved, one group reaching full noise as the coach drew level, falling as it passed, the next group already building ahead. It was like riding through a long sequence of large rooms, each one louder and more concentrated than the last, each one containing the same moment in its own form. James rode through all of them and held his pace and kept his face and let the sound move over him the way weather moves over a fixed point, registering it, being reached by it, not being shifted by it. Whitehall was the loudest section of the route. The stone buildings on either side compressed and reflected the noise in a way the open mall had not, doubled it, sharpened it, sent it across the face with physical force. James felt Gideon's body react beneath him, not a full spook, not a stumble, but the involuntary small contraction of an animal registering something very loud before the training intervenes. James helped with a fractional adjustment on the left rein, and the horse remembered himself and settled, and they moved through Whitehall together in the specific coordination of two beings who have spent enough shared hours in difficult conditions to have become, in the relevant sense, a single composed thing moving through an uncomposed world. Ahead, at the end of Parliament Street, Westminster Abbey appeared for the first time on the route, pale and enormous against the gray October sky, the kind of building that has been waiting for things to happen in front of it for so many centuries that your particular arrival barely adjusts its expectations. 300 meters. James had covered more than 3 kilometers already. His left knee had started making its quiet case somewhere in the Whitehall stretch, the old training injury, the hairline fracture from the indoor school fall 2 years back, which had healed correctly according to the medical officer and maintained its own private schedule on cold mornings and long rides. He acknowledged the complaint and declined to act on it and kept his weight where it needed to be and kept his pace. A child near the barrier on the left side of the street was being held above the crowd by her father, small, red-knitted hat, looking in entirely the wrong direction, absorbed by something in the architecture above the crowd, completely indifferent to what was passing 6 feet away. James filed her in the periphery, alongside everything else the road was giving him to carry. At the Abbey gates the formation slowed. James matched the change. The crowd sound shifted into something more restrained, the instinctive quieting that happens near buildings that carry more accumulated human feeling than any person can fully account for. The coach stopped. James stopped with it. He was in position, to the left and slightly rear of the carriage, the exact coordinates that 12 rehearsals had built into his body. Gideon stood beneath him without being asked. The ceremony at the Abbey doors began above and ahead, in a world James could not see and was not required to see. He was required to be here, in this spot, still, visible, part of the image. He held his reins. He sat straight. He breathed. He was here. He had built 9 years toward arriving here. Whatever had tried to prevent it, the boot, the sleepless night, 13 years of a conversation that had stalled at a kitchen window, he was here, and he was holding it, and the holding was complete. He thought, as the formation moved through the first section of the mall, about the rehearsals. 4 of them, over 3 months, at various hours and in various conditions. The first had been at 6 in the morning in September rain, the whole route walked and then ridden with the cobblestones wet, and the horses unhappy about it, and the crowd barriers empty, and the sense, throughout, of practicing a thing that would only become real when practiced for the last time. The second rehearsal had been better, the third better still, the fourth had been close enough to the real thing that James had felt something shift in him during it, the practice becoming familiarity, the rehearsal becoming the thing it was rehearsing, and he had ridden back to the Mews after it knowing that the day, when it came, would not surprise him. He had been wrong about that. The day had surprised him, not in the way of arriving differently from what he had prepared for. The route was the route, the pace was the pace, the formation was the formation. The surprise was in the quality of the thing, the weight of it, the specific weight of 3 million people choosing to stand on this road on this morning for this occasion, and what that weight did to the air and to the sound and to the way a man felt sitting on a horse in the middle of it. The rehearsal had approximated all of it. The approximation was not the thing. He had held the pace and kept the face and done the job through every section of the route, and the doing of the job was exactly what the job required. But inside the doing, in the corridor where the real life of a person continues behind the trained exterior, He had been aware at every section of the route that what was happening around him was something he would not easily find words for later. Not dramatic words, not the words of a man who had been through something exceptional and needed to report it. The quiet words that come to a person who has been part of something larger than himself and has managed to hold his place in it without dropping anything. Those words. Gideon had been perfect. James thought about that now, in the stillness at the Abbey gates, with the horse standing beneath him without being asked, and the city murmuring around them in its restrained and respectful October register. 16 hands of professional patience. An animal that had been trained to carry what was put on it, and go where it was pointed, and not make its feelings anyone else's problem, which was, James thought, an excellent description of the job, of any version of the job, mounted or otherwise. He pressed his left hand fractionally against the rein and felt the horse respond to the contact and hold. They had been doing that all morning. They would do it until the afternoon. That was sufficient. That was everything that was needed from either of them. The wait at the Abbey gates was longer than any of the rehearsals had prepared him for, and the rehearsals had been thorough in almost every other respect. In the rehearsals, a junior officer had stood in for the interior ceremony and given a signal at a pre-agreed time, and the formation had moved. Today there was no pre-agreed time. The ceremony inside the Abbey proceeded at its own pace, the pace of something that had been done in one form or another for centuries, and had never once adjusted its internal rhythm to accommodate the convenience of those standing outside in the cold. James held his position and let it proceed. He had practiced stillness in many environments over 9 years, cold mornings and hot afternoons, indoor schools and open ceremonial routes, training squares where the only sound was the cobblestones and the instructor's voice, and public roads where the sound was a crowd pressing against barriers 4 feet away. He had practiced it until it was a physical habit, not unconscious, because nothing in ceremonial work is truly unconscious, but automatic in the way that well-trained responses become automatic. The decision to hold was no longer a decision in the moment. It was the default condition of being in this job, the baseline from which everything else operated. This stillness was different from practice. Not in quality. His back was straight, his face was level, Gideon was steady beneath him. Different in weight. It was longer than any rehearsal. It had no visible end. And inside it, in the narrow corridor of awareness that ran behind the face and the back and the trained position, all the things the day had put in him were gathered and waiting, with nothing left to file them into. The knee reported its situation clearly now that the motion had ceased. Not the dull discomfort of the Whitehall stretch, but something more insistent, the body's way of announcing that it has been maintaining a fixed position in cold air for a long time, and the relevant joint has opinions it intends to express with increasing force. James declined to respond. He had declined for the last 40 minutes, and would continue declining until the job was finished. A television camera on a wheeled platform moved slowly along the line of guards, approximately 6 feet to his right. He felt it before it was fully in his visual field, the trained awareness of large moving objects nearby. The camera moved along the line, paused at the center, continued. Somewhere in Coventry a television was showing what that camera saw. His mother was in her armchair near the window, watching the broadcast and looking for him in the line. His father was across the room in the other chair. He was almost certain his father was watching. He had spent years being uncertain about what his father was doing and thinking, but on this point he felt no uncertainty. Edward Aldridge was in the armchair. The television was on. His father was watching his son in the line outside Westminster Abbey on a Tuesday morning, the way he watched every state occasion that involved his son, from beginning to end, in the chair, the jaw set, the tea cooling. James had been thinking about his father since Parliament Street, where the thought had arrived sideways without an invitation in the middle of holding 47 paces per minute and keeping the face and managing Gideon in Whitehall. He had filed it at the time, but the wait at the Abbey had given him time he could not fill with anything else, and the thought had returned, and now he was examining it with the unhurried clarity that a long-occupied stillness sometimes permits. Edward Aldridge had stood at a kitchen window 13 years ago for 10 seconds. He had said 2 words before that, and nothing after. James had built a story out of those 10 seconds that he had carried for 13 years, without examining whether it was accurate. The story was disapproval. The 2 words at the kitchen table were the text of it. The window was the delivery. The long silence after was the confirmation. He had carried this story into his enlistment and maintained it through 9 years of service, and it had been, in its way, genuinely useful. The quiet need to prove something, invisible, never spoken, never acknowledged even to himself, had made him work harder than he might otherwise have worked, had made him hold positions that were easier to leave, had kept him in the job on the difficult days when staying required more than the ordinary version of commitment. The story had powered him. That did not mean the story was accurate. He thought about the counter-evidence, not to dismantle a structure he had lived in, but in the spirit of accuracy which he valued above comfort. His father had watched every state occasion James could remember, every single one, without announced intention, without any expression of enthusiasm that James could observe, simply in the armchair when these occasions were broadcast, watching from beginning to end, the jaw set, the tea going cold. James had grown up watching his father watch these things and had not assigned it meaning because it was simply what Edward did, furniture of the household, unremarkable as the newspaper at breakfast or the standing at the kitchen window when something was too large to say. A man who does not respect something does not sit in an armchair and watch every broadcast of it for decades. A man who dismisses ceremonial as all that marching about does not arrange himself in front of the television every time ceremonial soldiering appears on the screen and remain there for the full duration, from opening to conclusion. His father had been doing something else, something James had not seen, or had seen and not named correctly, because naming it correctly would have required him to revise the story, and the story had been too useful to want to revise. His father had been present, continuously, consistently, without announcement, in the only language available to a man for whom the feeling was too large and the vocabulary for it too small. He had been in the chair. He had been watching, every time, without saying so, because some men carry pride the way other men carry grief, internally, at a depth that surfaces only in the jaw set against it, and the not moving from the chair for the full length of every broadcast. James thought about what it would feel like to be Edward Aldridge watching this morning's broadcast from Coventry, the 63-year-old man who had been good at a specific thing for 22 years and had then had it taken away and done smaller things after. Watching from the armchair his son doing something Edward himself had not done and could not have done in the same way, something requiring a discipline and a precision and a public visibility that existed entirely outside of anything Edward had personal experience with. Feeling, from the outside, a thing his son was doing from the inside, having no vocabulary adequate to what he felt watching it, or having the vocabulary but not the access to it, because some men have feelings the size of buildings and the vocabulary of garden sheds. That was not disapproval. That was something considerably more complicated and considerably more human than disapproval. That was a man carrying something in the only container available to him. James held this thought the same way he held his position, without showing it, without letting it reach the surface, without giving it any of the external space it was asking for. But he held it and did not file it, and it stayed in him as a thing that was going to require attention when the job was done. The crowd at the Abbey gates had settled into the low, sustained murmur of a very large number of people in the interval between the beginning and the completion of something they came a long way to see. Not silence, the particular softened quality of people near a building that carries more accumulated human weight than any living person can fully account for. James heard the quieting as a texture around him. He heard Gideon's steady breathing. He heard the west wind moving along Parliament Street and finding the gap between his collar and his neck with the specific cold of October in London. A woman near the front of the barrier, 50s, dark green coat, a small flag resting loosely in her hand that had stopped being waved and was now simply held, was watching the ceremony position with the expression of someone who has been somewhere long enough to stop performing the fact of being there and has settled into simply being there. James filed her in the periphery. He filed her alongside everything else the road had given him to carry. He thought about why he had not called his father when the posting came through. The surface answer was that he did not know what to say, which was true but incomplete. The full answer was beneath the surface answer, and he could see it clearly now in the stillness. He had not called, because calling would have required him to say, "I want you to know about this," which would have required him to say, "Your knowing matters to me," which would have required him to be, in a very specific and exposed direction, a man with a need. And he had spent his adult life constructing himself to be someone who did not bring needs in Edward Aldridge's direction, because the historical pattern of doing so had been the kitchen window and the subsequent silence, and he had not wanted to add another instance to the pattern. He had therefore not called, and had carried the posting in his pocket, and had told his mother on the Tuesday call, and had let the 4 days before the ceremony pass, without saying the thing there was to say. He had been doing, he understood, a version of the same thing his father did, carrying something without saying it, being present in the only language available. They were, it turned out, very similar men. They had arrived at that similarity by different routes and had not until this morning looked directly at it, but it was there, had been there all along, and the kitchen window and the 13-year silence were not evidence of a gap between them, but of the same person in two versions, neither version knowing how to read the other. The signal came. Not a sound, a movement propagating through the formation the way current moves through still water, felt in the body before the mind has named it. Gideon's weight shifted forward a fraction beneath him. James steadied the horse. The formal signal followed a moment later, and he moved. The coach moved, the formation turned, the abbey receded behind him, and the continuing ceremonial route opened ahead. Something in his chest found a different arrangement. Not relief, not pride, something that had been held at full compression for a long time and was now, in the smallest measurable degree, permitted to breathe. The return route was the same road in reverse, and it was not the same road at all. The crowds were louder going back. The full release of all the mornings held anticipation. James rode through it, and held his pace, and kept his face, and let London do what London was doing, which was everything. He filed a few final things. A boy near the barrier watching not the coach but Gideon, watching the horse with the total, committed admiration of a child who has decided this is the most significant thing he has seen in his life and cannot be redirected. An elderly woman in a folding chair behind the barriers, not cheering, not waving, crying without apology, her hands together in her lap, the kind of crying that happens when something reaches a place in a person that the person did not expect to be reached and they are not embarrassed about it. He looked at the middle distance, he let them be what they were. The palace gates arrived, the formation concluded, he rode through. The dismount was at 12 minutes past noon. He slid from the saddle, stood on cobblestones, let his legs find their arrangement. The knee made its case in clear and direct terms, now that the performance was no longer requiring it to be silent. He tested it, found it held, and made no visible adjustment. Parrish walked the line. He stopped at James half a second longer than at the others. "Well done, Corporal," Parrish said. "Thank you, sir," James said. Parrish moved on. James stood in the yard with the cold and the ache and the weight of the bearskin and 2 words from a colonel in his chest, and he decided not to examine what those 2 words had done quite yet. Later, when the uniform was off and the day was something he could look at from a small distance, he led Gideon in. He did the work that comes after the performance. He did it with the same steadiness he had brought to everything before it, which was the only way he knew how. He thought about the crowd, not the 3 million as a number. He had filed the number long ago at a safe distance and had not approached it directly since. He thought about the crowd as a series of specific moments. The woman near the barrier on the outward stretch of Whitehall who had not been watching the coach but had been watching the guards, specifically, with a focused attention that was different from the general watching, the attention of someone looking for a person and not for a spectacle. He had not looked at her directly. He had filed her. He was doing a great deal of filing. He thought about what it meant to be watched by 3 million people in the specific way that 3 million people on a ceremonial route watch a thing. Not the way you watch a concert or a sporting event, where you are engaged, where you respond, where the watching and the response are part of the same continuous event. The watching on a ceremonial route was different. It was the watching of people who have come to see something fixed and significant move past them at a measured pace. And what they are watching for is not entertainment but confirmation. Confirmation that the thing they have come to see is real and is happening and is what they understood it to be. They come in a sense to have something confirmed that they already believed, and the ceremonial guard is part of the confirmation. You are the image. Parrish had said it, and it was accurate. You are the thing that makes the thing real for the people watching it. James had understood this intellectually before today. He understood it differently now, from inside it, from the position of having been the confirmation for 3 million people's belief in something for 3 hours, of having carried that without dropping it. The understanding from inside was not more comfortable than the understanding from outside. It was heavier. It was also more accurate, and he preferred accuracy to comfort in most things. He thought about the specific section just before the Abbey gates, where the crowd had thinned slightly from the compression of Parliament Square, and there was a gap between groups where for a few steps he had ridden in something closer to quiet. Not silence. There was no silence today, not anywhere on the route, but a relative quiet, a lower register, a few steps where the noise was not at full volume, and he could hear Gideon's hooves clearly on the stone, and feel the rhythm of the horse beneath him, without the crowd sound competing with it. He had held those few steps carefully, had been aware of them as he moved through them, had given them the small, specific attention they deserved before the next section of crowd arrived and the noise built again. He had been filing that too, the quiet within the noise, the brief intervals between the rooms. His mother would be watching with the curtains open. She always watched the big occasions with the curtains open. He had observed this on the few occasions he had been home during state broadcasts, her chair positioned to catch the light from the window while the television played, as though she needed the room to be connected to the outside world, while the outside world was doing something significant. He hoped the curtains were letting in enough light. He hoped her tea was warm. He hoped she had found him in the line, though he was almost certain she had, because she had never failed to find him in anything, in 31 years of looking. His father was across the room from her, in the chair that had shaped itself to him, watching the same screen. James had been wrong about the watching for 13 years, and he understood that now, but the understanding was something he needed to set down and examine in the right conditions, which these were not, and he did not try to do the full examination here. He simply held the understanding the way he was holding everything else, steadily, without pressure, in the place that things go when they are too important to rush and too significant to set aside. The barracks at 4 in the afternoon had the quality of a place that has been very important and is now learning to be ordinary again. The corridor was quieter. The other men had dispersed to showers, food, and the necessary process of becoming themselves again after the ceremonial version of themselves has been at the controls all day. James's room had 3 other occupants, all of them elsewhere. He sat on the edge of his bunk in a white t-shirt and gray trousers, and one boot, the other on the floor beside him, and he held his phone. His mother, Pauline, had sent a message at 11:48 that morning, timed while the formation was still at the Abbey. It was a screenshot from the television broadcast, slightly blurred at the edges where her crop had not quite caught the frame cleanly, showing the mounted guard in position outside Westminster Abbey. 12 identical figures in scarlet and gold, precise and motionless. She had circled one of them with the drawing tool on her phone. The circle was slightly unsteady, the circle of a person doing it quickly because the image was passing, and she needed to mark it before it went. Below the image, she had typed 2 words, "Found you." James looked at the photograph for a long time, the shaky red circle, around a figure that any general viewer would say was indistinguishable from the 11 beside it. His mother had found him in it anyway. She had located him inside the uniform using the specific knowledge that accumulates over 31 years of looking at one particular person, the set of his shoulders, the exact angle of his chin, the particular quality of stillness that was his and not anyone else's, even when everything about the exterior matched 11 others in a line. She had been looking specifically for him. She had found him. She had drawn the circle with her thumb on a phone screen in a house in Coventry to prove that she had. He removed the second boot and set both of them on the floor. He found the compression wrap under the bunk and applied it to his knee with the efficiency of someone who has performed this task many times and knows precisely the right tension. His hands knew what to do without instructions. Then he lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. He thought about his father. Not sideways. Not in the compressed and managed way he usually approached the subject, keeping it at the comfortable distance of something long decided and properly filed. He thought about it directly, in the quiet of a room where no performance was required, and the face could be exactly what it was and no more. Edward Aldridge had watched every state occasion James could remember, every single one, not with enthusiasm, not with any expression James had been able to read as warmth or acknowledgement or anything in that category, simply present, in the armchair, watching from the beginning of each broadcast to its conclusion, the jaw set in its characteristic way, the tea going cold in the mug beside the chair, the television on, and his father in front of it for the full duration, absorbing it in silence, every time, for as long as James had been old enough to notice the pattern. James had read this silence as disapproval for 13 years. He understood now, in the quiet of the barracks room, that the reading had been wrong. He had arrived at this understanding on Parliament Street. It had come to him in the gap between what his body was doing and what his mind was doing, the brief interior freedom that a long-held position sometimes permits. He had turned it over on the return route, and he was certain of it now. A man who disapproves of something does not watch every broadcast of it for decades without exception. A man who dismisses ceremonial soldiering as all that marching about does not arrange himself in the armchair and not move from it for the full duration of every state occasion his son is involved in, from the opening shot to the conclusion. His father had been doing something else entirely, something that looked, from outside, like the absence of enthusiasm, but was in fact the presence of something too large for Edward Aldridge's available vocabulary. His father had been in the chair. He had been watching. He had been watching with the specific focused attention of a person looking for one particular thing in a lot of visual information. His son, in the line, doing the thing his son did. Being there, because being there was the only language the feeling had available to it. James thought about what it would cost a man like Edward Aldridge to sit in that chair for 9 years of state occasions and say nothing about it. He knew the cost. He knew it from the inside, because he had been paying a version of it himself, the cost of carrying something significant without articulating it, of being present in a way that the people nearest you cannot easily read, of having a vocabulary too small for the feeling, and using silence where words would have served better. They were, he understood, the same man in 2 generations. They had arrived at the same shape of carrying things by different routes and had spent 13 years not recognizing each other in it. He thought about the shaky red circle, his mother at the window, watching the broadcast, scanning 12 identical figures, finding him in under a minute because she had 31 years of detailed knowledge of his particular silhouette and had been looking specifically for him and not for any of the others. He thought about the other person in the room, across from her, in the larger chair. His father had not sent a message. His father did not send messages easily, for the same reason Edward Aldridge did not say things easily, which was that the internal mechanism that connected feeling to expression had never run smoothly and had not been serviced adequately across 63 years of not quite knowing how. But his father had watched, had been in the chair, had not moved. James lay on the bunk and held all of this the way he had been holding things all day, without letting it reach the surface, without giving it more than the internal space it was claiming, which was considerable. He thought about calling, not as a decision. The decision had already been made, somewhere on the return route, in the space behind the face and the pace. He would call. The question was only when, and whether the self currently sitting in a t-shirt and socks in a barracks room was the right version of himself from which to make the call. He needed to be the ordinary version, not the ceremonial one, which was still somewhere in the room with him, fading but present. The ordinary version, the one in gray trousers and thick socks, the one that had existed before the training, shaped it into anything specific. The one that was simply James and not Corporal Aldridge or mounted escort or the image or any of the things the day had required. He needed another hour, maybe two. The dark coming in outside the window, and the building going quieter, and the ordinary evening doing what ordinary evenings did. Then he would be ready. He had a lot of time to think in the barracks room, while the October afternoon became evening. He thought about 9 years of building something toward a destination. He thought about the day it had arrived. Not only the route and the abbey and the coach, but all of it. The whole accumulated weight of it, arriving in a single Tuesday and being exactly what 9 years of work had been building toward, and not disappointing the building at all. He thought about the shaky red circle and what it meant that his mother had drawn it. Not carefully, not with steady hands, but quickly, because the moment was passing and she needed to mark it before it was gone. He thought about his father in the armchair not moving. He thought about the jaw. He thought about the 10 seconds at the kitchen window, and about what a man stands at a kitchen window to do, which is to put a distance between himself and the room, between himself and what is being felt, because the room is too small for the feeling, and the window gives the feeling somewhere to look. He understood the window now. He had understood it on Parliament Street, and the understanding had continued to clarify through the Abbey wait and the return route, and the 2 words from Parish, and the walk back to the barracks, and the 2 hours of lying on the bunk letting it all settle. He understood the window as clearly as he understood the thing he did with his face in the line, which was the same movement in a different uniform. The feeling too large for the room, the available distance used to give it space. His father had been doing it for 63 years. James had been doing it for 9. They were both, in their different contexts, doing the same thing, and the only thing wrong with it was that they had been doing it in separate rooms without knowing the other one was there. He picked up the phone. He opened the conversation with his mother first. "Thank you for the photo," he typed. "I saw it." She replied in under a minute. "Your dad watched the whole thing," she wrote. "Did not leave the chair once. Sat there from beginning to end. I thought you should know." James read it twice. He set the phone face up on the blanket beside him and looked at the ceiling for a while. His father had not moved, had watched his son in the line for the full duration of the broadcast, from the formation out of the palace gates to the conclusion of the return route, without leaving the armchair, present in the only language available to him, for the full duration, without announcement. James put the phone down. He was ready now. He opened the conversation with his father. He pressed the number. He put the phone to his ear. He lay on the bunk and let the barracks room be what it was, and the afternoon be what it was becoming, which was evening. The light at the window changed from flat gray to the particular amber dark of October streetlights coming on, the city settling into its evening version of itself outside. He heard a pair of boots in the corridor, someone returning to the floor, not his room, moving past. He heard the distant sound of a kettle from the common room. Ordinary sounds, the ordinary evening assembling itself around the day. He thought about the 9 years that had produced today, not in the narrative sense. He did not, as a general practice, tell himself stories about his own career in the voice of someone looking back on them with the benefit of arrangement. But he thought about the accumulation of it. The rehearsals in the rain in September, the formation work in Hyde Park Barracks, with the horses unhappy about the cobblestones, the overseas tour where the ceremonial postings were mixed with entirely non-ceremonial work that had tested other parts of him than the ones the uniform tested. The long stretches of the ordinary work that made up the majority of 9 years, but which the 9 years would not have been what they were without. The mornings when staying in the job was the thing being decided, and the decision was made the way he made most decisions, which was quietly and without announcement and by simply continuing. He thought about Corporal Fletcher in the supply room at 4:18 in the morning, finding him a replacement pair of boots, without being asked, and without comment, and going back to bed. That was, James thought, an entire philosophy in a single action. the recognition of what is needed and the provision of it without making a production of the recognition or the provision. He had been doing versions of that for 9 years, and he had been on the receiving end of versions of it many times, from instructors and sergeants and fellow soldiers who had assessed a situation and moved on the assessment without speeches. He appreciated it. He had always appreciated it. He thought it was the best possible way to operate, and he thought that his father, in his own way and in his own context, had been operating on the same principle for a long time. In the armchair, with the television on, watching, and not making a production of the watching. He thought about what he was going to say on the phone, not as a script. He had decided not to script it, and the decision stood, but as a direction. The direction was, I know, everything after that could follow the conversation wherever the conversation went, which was the right approach for a conversation with Edward Aldridge. You did not lead with a destination. You led with an opening, and you let the man find his own way through it, because Edward Aldridge found his way through things on his own timeline and in his own order, and you could not help him by trying to accelerate the process. The opening was, I know you watched. After that, whatever came. After that, the conversation. James sat up and applied the compression wrap more firmly, checked the fit, decided it was correct, and stood up fully from the bunk. The knee accepted the weight. Not gratefully. The knee had not yet reached a place of gratitude, and probably would not until tomorrow at the earliest, but without objection strong enough to require a change of plan. He walked to the window and looked out at the barracks yard and the thin strip of London sky visible above the roofline, now properly dark, the orange quality of London after dark from the streetlights below. The city doing what the city did in the evening, which was to compress itself into its lit and warm interior version and proceed. He was ready. He picked up the phone. He opened the conversation with his father. He pressed the contact and put the phone to his ear and waited for it to ring, which it did 3 times, and then his father answered with his name, James, in the way you say someone's name when you have been holding it at the ready, and James said, Hi, Dad, and the conversation that should have happened 13 years ago, or some version of it, the version available to them now, began. The ordinary evening came quietly, in the way that ordinary evenings come after days that have been anything but. The light in the barracks room moved from gray afternoon into the firm October dark that London commits to by 5 o'clock without apology. James lay on his bunk in his socks and felt the building reassemble around him. Footsteps in the corridor, water in the pipes, voices from the common room at the far end of the floor, the other men returning to themselves after the day. He slept for 2 hours. The sleep came suddenly and completely. The specific collapse of a body that has been running on commitment and adrenaline for too many hours and has now received the signal that nothing more is required of it tonight. He woke at 6:17, which he knew from the phone still lying beside him with his mother's message on the screen. He lay still for a moment and let the room reassemble. The ceiling, the twice-painted crack along the far junction, the compression wrap on his knee, which had been doing its work quietly while he slept. He sat up and tested the knee. Weight on it. A few steps to the window and back. Manageable. Rest and wrapping had moved it in the right direction, and he would mention it to the medical officer tomorrow and let the professional assessment determine what the next rehearsal schedule needed, if anything. He dressed. Gray trousers, dark blue shirt, thick socks against the October cold coming through the window frame in the way old barracks windows permitted. He did not put his boots back on. He sat on the edge of the bunk in his socks with the phone in his hand and his father's name on the screen. He had been thinking, during the sleep and the waking and the dressing, about what he was going to say. He caught himself scripting it and stopped. He had made that mistake before with his father, and he knew where it led. His father could sense a prepared speech arriving before the first sentence was complete, and something in Edward would close, and the conversation would not go where it needed to go. His father responded to the ordinary, unprepared version of his son. He responded to James calling because it was time to call, not because James had assembled the right words in advance. What he actually wanted to say was simple. I know you watched. That was the substance of it. I know you watched, And I know what that means, and I think we have been trying to say the same thing to each other for a long time in a register neither of us could receive clearly. He pressed the contact. He put the phone to his ear. It rang 3 times. Then his father answered. James, his father said, not hello. His name, said in the way you say someone's name when you have been holding it at the ready and are not surprised by the call and are not performing unsurprise either. His name in his father's voice, with the Coventry accent modified by 22 years of a factory floor, the same clipping of certain vowels that James heard in his own speech, in certain words when he was not paying attention. Hi, Dad, James said. A short silence, the particular silence of 2 people arriving at a significant conversation, and each deciding, simultaneously, whether to acknowledge that. How is the knee? His father said. James went still. How do you know about the knee? He said. Your mother mentioned it a while back. Some chain. She said you had a knock. A pause. I noticed on the return today, just slightly, the way you were carrying the left side. James sat on the edge of his bunk in his socks in the October dark. His father had been watching from Coventry through a television screen and had noticed that his son was carrying his left side fractionally wrong on a ceremonial return route. He had been watching that closely. He had been looking for exactly that level of detail, the kind of detail you look for when you have been watching a specific person carefully for a long time. It is fine, James said. The knee is all right. Good, his father said. Then, with the directness of a man who has made a decision and is acting on it before the moment passes, you held your position well, the whole way. I watched all of it. I know you watched, James said. Mum told me. I know she did. A pause. I watched them all. Every occasion I know you are in. Every one, for years. I know, James said. You could not have known, his father said. I never said. James thought about that. I should have asked, he said. Another pause, longer and carrying more, the weight of 2 people arriving at the same realization from opposite directions and recognizing the distance they have covered to get there. I should have said, his father said, at the kitchen table, when you enlisted, I should have said the right thing and I said the wrong thing, or I said too little, or both. I have been aware of it for 13 years. You said what you said, James said. And then I stood at the window, his father said. The window was not what you thought it was. I know, James said. I worked it out today, on Parliament Street as it happens. A sound on the line, something at the edge of a short, quiet laugh, the sound of a man catching himself at an emotion he had not expected this call to produce, or not at this point in it. You always did that, his father said. Worked things out on your own, never asked anyone, just went very quiet and went around the whole thing twice, and by the time you said anything, you had already arrived somewhere. That is a family trait, James said. It is, his father agreed. From my side, I should have given you the key along with the trait. They were quiet together for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet from the ones that had populated their phone calls for years. Less like an absence, more like 2 people sharing a space without feeling the need to fill it, which is something you can do with another person only after enough time has passed and enough has been said. I am proud of you, his father said. He said it with the directness of a man who has rehearsed the moment enough times to know that only directness will get the sentence out complete. I have been proud of you for a long time, and I did not say it clearly, and I am saying it clearly now, so there is no window to stand at. James let the words arrive fully. He let them settle where they were going to settle, which was somewhere central and not temporary, somewhere that had been expecting exactly this wait for exactly as long as the silence had lasted, which was 13 years. Thank you, Dad, he said. His voice was level. His face was doing nothing visible, because nobody was looking at it, and the habit of 9 years does not stop simply because the performance is over. He let the feeling be what it was, large and warm, and not requiring any performance of itself, without letting it reach the surface. He was always going to be a man who held things internally. That was not going to change, But he was also, and this was the new thing, letting the feeling stay at its actual size rather than immediately finding a smaller container for it. The actual size was considerable. He let it be that. "I know you are," James said. "I think I have always known somewhere. I think I was reading the way you showed it wrong." "You were not entirely wrong," his father said, with the careful honesty of a man who is not letting himself off a hook. "It was complicated for me, watching you do something I had not done, knowing I could not have done it in the same way. That kind of thing sits in a man at an angle and does not always come out as what it actually is. What it actually is, in my case, is pride. What it came out as was the window and the jaw, apparently. Your mother has mentioned the jaw on several occasions." "The jaw was difficult to read," James said. "I know," his father said. "I am sorry for the jaw." James almost laughed. He did not, but it was close. "I will forgive the jaw," he said. "Good of you," his father said. The sound on the line again, the almost laugh, fuller this time, warmer. "Then, I also want to ask you something, if that is all right." "Go ahead," James said. "What does it feel like, being inside it, being that close to the coach when it is in motion, with the crowd at that scale?" A pause that was genuine curiosity. "I have watched it on the screen for 9 years, and I have always wondered what it feels like from inside." James thought about this. It was not a question anyone had ever asked him in quite those terms, and he took a moment to locate the honest answer, the one that came from the inside and not from the official version. He described the sound of the coach in motion, the way it came up through the road surface, and through Gideon's hooves, and through the saddle into his body, before his ears had processed it, the specific quality of 4 tons of accumulated history in forward motion that no rehearsal could replicate, because the crowd was the thing that made it real, and the crowd could not be rehearsed. He described the 47 paces per minute, and the exact difference between holding that pace in an empty training square and holding it with 3 million people watching from every available angle. He described Whitehall and the way the stone buildings sent the noise back, doubled so that you felt it in the front of your face, and how Gideon had felt beneath him in Whitehall when the sound was at its most compressed, and how a fractional adjustment on the left rein was sufficient to steady a 16-hand horse in a moment like that when the horse trusted the rider completely. He described the crowd going quieter when the coach appeared, the shift that registered in the rib cage before the mind had named it. His father listened without interrupting. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like something I would not have been able to do," he said. "You do not know that," James said. "I do," his father said, without apology and without self-pity, simply stating it as the accurate thing. "But I know someone who can. I have been watching him do it, and today was something worth watching, from the armchair in Coventry. I want you to know that." James was quiet for a moment. He let that arrive alongside everything else the day had put in him. "Thank you for watching," he said. "I have always been watching," his father said. They talked for 30 minutes more. They talked about the knee and the replacement boots, and Fletcher in the supply room at 4:18 in the morning, which produced the sound from his father that had been getting closer to a proper laugh all call, and finally became one, quiet and brief and real. They talked about Gideon, the warmth in the stable at 6:50, the dark eye turning to look, the steadiness in Whitehall. His father asked more questions, good ones, asked with genuine interest, the questions of a man who has been observing something from outside for a long time and wants to understand what the inside of it feels like. When they said goodbye, it had the ease of a conversation that has arrived somewhere. Not dramatic, clean, sufficient, a different quality of ending from their previous calls, which had tended to finish on the slight flat note of a conversation that had not quite arrived anywhere, and both parties knew it and did not mention it. "James," his father said, just before the end. "Yeah," James said. The holding still, the face, the whole day of it, 9 years of it. A pause. "I know what that costs. I want you to know that I know it." James was quiet for a moment. "I know you know, Dad," he said. He did not say anything else. Neither of them needed him to. What he had said covered most of the 13 years, and most of what was in them, and everything that was going to come after, which was the calls that would now happen from ordinary evenings for no specific reason except that it was time. "Good night," his father said. "Good night, Dad," James said. He set the phone face up on the blanket. He sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at the window, the rectangle of October dark above the barracks rooftops. Somewhere out there, the mall was clear of barriers. The Abbey was dark and closed. The Gold State coach was still in the Royal Mews, the gold leaf quiet in the dark, the enormous public day absorbed back into the long, ordinary time that surrounded it on either side. 3 million people had dispersed on trains and in cars and on foot, carrying their flags and their photographs and the particular warmth of having stood in the cold to witness something worth witnessing. James Aldridge sat in his socks on his bunk and breathed. In through the nose, out slowly, again. He thought about tomorrow, Wednesday, the corridor at 5:30, the cobblestones, the breath in the cold air. Corporal Aldridge again, in the ordinary schedule, doing the ordinary work that followed major postings. He would mention the knee to the medical officer. He would collect his original boots from the locker. Fletcher had retrieved them from the bin and had them resoled and left them with a note that said good as new in Fletcher's characteristic handwriting, which used as few letters as the words permitted. He would call his father again, not next week necessarily, not with a specific agenda, some ordinary evening, from the ordinary self, because there was more to talk about now, and his father was available for it. The only thing that had ever been missing was the call. He lay back and looked at the twice-painted crack in the ceiling, and let the October evening settle around the building, and let the day be entirely, finally over. He thought about the crack in the boot sole at 4 in the morning. He thought about it as the beginning of a day that had contained, by its end, considerably more than a 3-kilometer escort of the Gold State coach to Westminster Abbey and back. He thought about Fletcher handing over the replacements without being asked, and without comment, and going back to bed. He thought about Parrish saying steady and it being enough. He thought about the sound the coach made in motion that no rehearsal had prepared him for. He thought about Gideon in the stable at 6:50, the warmth under his palm, the dark eye turning to look. He thought about the shaky red circle, his mother drawing it quickly with her thumb because the image was passing and she needed to mark it before it was gone. Found you. He thought about his father in the armchair, not moving, the whole broadcast, every broadcast, for 9 years, every state occasion his son was in, watched from beginning to end, the tea going cold, the jaw set against the size of the feeling, the presence unannounced and consistent and continuous. James lay on the bunk and let all of it be in him at once, the boot and the too large replacement, the 47 paces per minute, the knee and the Abbey gates, and 2 words from a colonel, the shaky red circle, the 35 minutes on the phone with his father. He let it be in him at its actual size, which was the size of 9 years and 13 years combined, which was the size of a man arriving at a thing he had been building toward for a very long time, and finding it exactly as significant as he had known it would be. He did not allow himself to feel the full weight of it. Not yet. Some things needed the ordinary days after, the Wednesdays and Thursdays and corridors at 5:30, before they could be felt without the feeling becoming too large for the room it was being felt in. He was very good at holding things until the moment was right. He had been practicing since he was 7 years old, at a kitchen table in Coventry, watching a man push back his chair and walk to the window and go still, holding something too large for the room in the only way available to him, which was to stand at the window and look out at the ordinary yard and say nothing. James understood the window now, understood what was behind the jaw, and what the tea going cold meant, and what 13 years of watching a television broadcast from an armchair, without saying a word about it, said, loudly and clearly, to anyone who knew how to listen. He let the light go out. He let the ceiling be the ceiling. He let himself rest, fully and without any remaining performance, in the dark October quiet of a barracks room that was just a room. He had earned it. Today had said so, entirely and without question. He had earned it.